Bonjour, bonsoir, dear friends. Welcome to JCB Live in this beautiful month of October. We're in full mode of harvest. So we thought we would bring you one of the most talented, fascinating, intellectual, and magical winemaker of the heart of Napa Valley. Trained in France, of course, he was about to become a physician till he had a fabulous, enlightening moment. He decided to become a very talented winemaker. Moved to Napa Valley, and since 1990 has been leading Cane Winery. He is one of the best there is, and very fortunately for me, has been a friend for a long time, and is the ultimate charming bicultural man. So, dear friends, I'm very pleased to introduce you, and you know who he is by now when I said Cane, the famous Chris Howell. This is him, and him only, with a glass of foreverness. And I'm trying not to create a magma of foam, but I'm still gonna help him to come on the studio. Look at this. Dear friends, Chris Howell. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Comment ça va, Chris?
Oui, ça va bien et mieux.
Et mieux
Merci.
maintenant qu'on a un verre de bulle.
Okay.
So, Chris, I have so many questions crossing my mind. Freshness from Napa Valley for you. Can you believe vintage 20?
Très fin.
16, merci. Et regarde, le petit diamant pour toi parce que c'est pour toujours. So he could bring that to his beautiful wife, who is phenomenal, and then they can have a foreverness moment. So Chris, how did you manage to realize so early in your life, and I say that as an advice for all our friends in the world watching, that it was not becoming a doctor, it was becoming a winemaker?
You know, I think what's interesting about wine is every one of us who gets to this finds their way through passion. I think we always get there because we choose it, not because we fell into it. In fact, a generation preceding you
Yes.
found themselves trapped in their world of Burgundy. And they felt like they needed to escape. Some became actors in Paris, and some did other things. But another group comes back to rediscover and appreciate what there is. And in a world that's increasingly virtual, increasingly disconnected from nature, some of us want to work with our hands and want to work with plants and the elements and rediscover it in the glass. And that, I think, is exactly why you're here too.
Oh, for sure. And now for you, how did that happen? I mean, you study physics, chemistry. You are this brain where everything in your mind leads you to become a physician. And you discover wine. How did you discover
I
wine?
have to take it back just a step. But I want to say that I've always appreciated food, and then from food comes wine. And in the midst of all the things I studied, which I would not consider myself good at any of these things, but
He's very modest.
what I studied first was philosophy. And from philosophy, I think, comes a lot, especially when we think about aesthetics, about appreciation of beauty and about perception, sense, cognition, emotion. All these things come together. From there, I went to something practical. To prepare for medicine, I did chemistry. And in the midst of all of this, I just found myself enthralled with wine. And finally someone said to me, you know, if you like wine so much, why aren't you making it? And it seemed like almost like a défi. It was a challenge that I had to do it. And having made it, they said, wow, you should be doing this. And it's hard to take that seriously if you grow up in Seattle, as I did.
Yes.
However, I think here's a wonderful story. My father, an aeronautical engineer for Boeing, was sent off to Torino to work with Italians because they were competing with your company, Airbus.
Of course.
And
They tried to compete.
And what did the Italians do on Sunday? They took him to Mama for dinner. the marvelous family meal, which in France too is the most
For sure.
important meal, is the Sunday dinner,
Yes.
which happens in the middle of the day. And he came back totally indoctrinated with the idea of food and wine and shared that with all of us. So I had that in my background, and I found my way to Europe through my first wife, who grew up in Geneva.
In Geneva, yeah.
And from there, I was introduced to Burgundy.
And that was the
That
point of
was
no
just
return.
Absolutely. And I want to share this idea with your people. We all have this moment, you could call it an epiphany.
Yes.
A moment when all the senses come together. You smell, you taste, and you think, oh my God, what is in this glass?
And
And that moment doesn't require words. It goes deeply beyond words.
do you remember the wine you were actually drinking?
It was a wine from Burgundy. It was a Clos de Lambray.
Talking about a wine, that's quite a
And it was
Grand
it
Cru.
was 14 years old,
Yes.
and it just for me the perfume took over the whole evening.
And what's to you, Chris, today as you reflect of all those phenomenal years of winemaking, vineyard management, and pouring wine around the world, the meaning of wine, really?
It connects us to our humanity, Jean-Charles. You know, because you focus on the senses, that the senses are what separate us from machines.
Yes.
The senses are the thing that it's beyond just the perception, because we can have cameras that will see things. Computers could try to interpret it and maybe recognize your face in an airport. But when will they truly feel what that all means? Because this brings us back to the earth.
That's right.
Ties us to the earth, ties us to the seasons, it ties us to our physical humanity. And since you're always talking about sex, we should know
Who, me or you?
the power.
Maybe Freud,
But
one of the psychologists you've studied when you were at
the
school.
power of scent
Yes.
is deep. It goes deeper than any of the other senses. It is the first thing that connects us to the world. Even the most rudimentary organism, think of a single-celled organism swimming in a sea of whatever. It
Yeah.
needs to sense what's around it,
That's
to locate
true.
where it is. So smell brings us back to our emotions and our memories
That's right.
and our passion.
And now, as you connected to philosophy, who was for you the philosopher that really connected that sensory to sense of humanity that you just described to all those emotions?
You know, I didn't have that. I really didn't. And so I could use what I learned from the classics.
Yes.
But I realized in that sense, you might think really Socrates and the cave, where you only see the shadow, only if you want, the image.
That's right.
Which could also be the illusion. But because you're never quite sure what is there and what's real. But I wouldn't say I would have applied it at that point. What I was very interested in, even at the beginning of my interest in wine, was perfume.
Mm-hmm.
And is because of the power and the complexity of what perfume can do. What interests me more about wine is it's not purely composed.
That's right.
As a perfume can be. And the wine comes from circumstances we don't control. So that every wine from every vineyard, every vintage will and can, or at least can be, has the potential to be different.
But as a scientist that you are, because you have a brain that understands everything that surrounds us.
Qui va bien. Not really.
No, but it's very impressive because you really have that mind. How do you feel about that uncontrollable in wine?
That's the part that we love. That's the spark. Because if it were all predictable and manufactured, we wouldn't be here.
That's true.
That's really the key, is to preserve that individuality and the diversity. And so I will say one experience I had in France, because I was working in Bordeaux, you know, in the famous chateaus, pretty large organizations, we're aware of the name of the property and its history, but the people who work in the vineyards and in the cellar are frequently unknown to most of us.
Yes.
And so what I discovered, and this was still true in Burgundy in the 80s, the name of the vineyard or the name of the property took precedence over the individual who is the caviste or the cellar master. So some of us may know some of these people's names, but mostly we don't. And I believe, coming full circle,
Yes.
that the winemaker does need to step away and back. We have famous chefs, and that's wonderful, but when it comes to wine, it should not be about the person, it should be about the place. So
you're a true terroiriste.
absolutely, and we have to say, in modern era, which would be the last 500 years, Burgundy is the berceau of terroir. We know that the idea of terroir, the whole concept that what we smell and taste, not just in wine, but in anything grown in the earth, can reflect the place.
Yes.
And that's been known for thousands of years. And you can read this, you can see references from the Egyptians as well as from the Greeks and the Romans to where a particular wine grew and when and all of that. But these things come and go and they get lost. But Burgundy held on to that flame.
Well, you work very hard and with a great focus in Napa Valley to exemplify the same vision as well. I
learned it. I learned it in Burgundy,
Yes.
truly, because you don't see it so much in Bordeaux. People will like to say it, but if we could, can I say this?
Of course.
Okay, so
They will never hold it against you.
I was very lucky.
Maybe the Bordelais.
I was. Yes, watch out. I was given so much by
Yes.
so many French people, and so much was shared with me. I was lucky to go to school in Montpellier and in Bordeaux and to work at Mouton Rothschild. But what I discovered there was that in Bordeaux, this is 40 years ago, they were uncomfortable with the idea of terroir, that you Burgundians embraced
That's right.
completely.
And that was a way for them to differentiate themselves and say, okay, well, we're not about terroir, we're just about blending, right?
Yeah, well, there was that, and it's the flavor of the house, or perhaps, it was more like a Victorian manufactured product, almost like Heinz ketchup. It has to be like this versus that. And the effect of the place, we were a little less convinced of it, and there were good reasons for it. First of all, they didn't work with single vineyards, truly.
Yeah.
They weren't focused on a single terroir. They had multiple terroirs, so they were blending, as you say. And also, they were more focused on the brand and less on the place.
Yes.
And in Burgundy, people never went there. Well, at least, I will say, you're at the cusp of this between the world of négociant and the vigneron.
Yes.
Because the négociant, especially in the 19th century in Burgundy, certainly focused on their brand.
That's
not
it.
so much on the
And the style of a house.
the style of the house.
So you could say Bouchard-René is this, Jafflin is this, Ropito is this. Yeah, there was a style. Now, when you came to Napa Valley, what was your vision with the next wine we're going to try, Cane, to create?
It was just this idea that in France we knew of vineyards that had been around for hundreds of years, that we could recognize these places since forever. Why can't we do this here in the New World?
That's right.
And I'm just young enough and just aware enough, there was no point anymore in trying to copy some other wine region. In other words, you may have heard of Burgundian Pinot Noirs or Burgundian Chardonnays or wines that are so-called Bordeaux blends. And it was the first thing I tried to eliminate from our vocabulary at Cane was any reference to Bordeaux, because having lived in Saint-Julien and worked in Pauillac for a year, I knew we were not in Bordeaux.
And you
talking
worked
about
in the
it is
top
embarrassing.
estates. Yeah, in the top chateaus. So
I was lucky.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate, but I knew that we had little to say about Bordeaux.
well, which is exciting though. You've created your own identity, which is really the
we
goal.
discovered.
You
we
discovered.
We uncover. We reveal, if you will. It's not us creating. It is what is there.
Well said.
And that's what our challenge in this generation of Napa Valley is, to find ourselves. And what's so ironic is, of course, as you know, some of the Bordelais are becoming more like us.
That's right.
And that just took 40 years.
Well, they're discovering
That's
themselves
ridiculous.
too.
I would hope so.
So as a nose, as we're going to move to your beautiful wine and keep talking about terroir in Napa Valley, what do you sense in that Napa Valley Because you taste with your nose, as you described earlier. Your nose is essential, as you almost made perfume. Did you actually ever make perfume?
Only for fun. No. But we all know Alexandre Schmidt.
Yeah, for sure.
Coming from the great school of perfume in Versailles. You know,
Blanc de Blanc, 100% Chardonnay, dear friends, from Napa Valley. So 2016 vintage. Huh? Just to tell you what we're having, the famous Foreverness.
I love it. Foreverness. So, could you say apple and quince?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, specifically now, in the month that we're going to be enjoying with Halloween and then
October.
Thanksgiving, quince is really present to me in this wine.
Good.
I'm a big fan. I like the thin bubbles, and it's obviously a big challenge to make sparkling wine in Napa Valley, frankly, versus Burgundy or Champagne. But I think it's.
Could you say why?
What do you think?
Well, it's so, relatively speaking, we think of Champagne as a cold region, which it used to be. And the process of bubbles helped develop a wine with more character than the thin, acidic, unripe grapes of Champagne.
That's right.
But what we learned with great Champagne is the grapes have to be ripe. It doesn't work otherwise.
That's it.
And what happened in our country, preceding all of what you've done, is people were picking grapes that were frankly vegetables. They were still legumes. And because of that, they've created an inferior sparkling wine, which have no great interest. If you really want to know what's good about a sparkling wine, is to let it first warm up, which it has done.
Yeah.
It will begin to express itself, allow the bubbles to die down a bit. Perhaps in the moment of excitement is not the moment to most appreciate a wine. But if you come back the next day after the party, and what's
If
in
there's
the
still
glass,
wine left.
if there's a bit in the bottom of a glass and it looks good, it smells good, that's a sign that you were having something really special.
That's very true. Let's never forget that it's a great wine with bubbles,
That's
not
right.
reverse.
That's right. And you can sense that here.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So then we ought to try. Do we start
we
with
start with the old one.
We start with the old one, so that's fantastic. So Chris wanted us to decant it in our wonderful passion collection.
Did you design this thing?
Indeed. And it's reminiscent, as you could see, on the shoulder of the 18th century, with le rime ici, and ici également avec le bouton, the button, right here, which is diamond cut to bring the light in, and a long neck and a very thin one. You could barely put a finger in.
That's right.
So it's a very gentle flow. You know, that was really the idea with this decanter. But look at it, next to cane. So what are we having, Chris?
So, well, I should say two things. One,
well, maybe
I've gotten
dispose.
I've gotten myself a bit confused, but that's fine. We're right where we want to be. This is actually the young wine, because that's why it was decanted. I decanted the young wine, which is 2016. And
Wine
the
and
older
nose.
wine is 08. But following bubbles, and Jean-Charles, you know this very well, it's not easy to be a red wine.
That's right.
It's usually would be nicer to have the red wine refreshed by the bubbles after.
Yeah, well, we'll do that too.
Okay, fine.
So those are the cloches of Notre Dame. So
Façon.
a question I got to ask you, dear friends. Chris graduated from the very famous École Nationale Supérieure Agronomique, one of the top schools of France
Right.
in agriculture.
Right.
I mean, so many friends are telling me I want to go back to school, or I'm thinking of going to school in France. How was that for you? Because at the time, I'm sure your French was not as perfect as today. How was it in
That's
French?
a fun story.
Yeah, tell us about
I
this.
love this story because I chose a school that I'd read about in a book written on Chateau Lafitte, and I learned that the great régisseur, the father of Bernard Portet, had gone to this school in Montpellier. And in our country, America, we had hardly heard of this school. And we all know about Bordeaux, but we didn't know anything about this place. And I made up my mind I wanted to go to there and it's an école, not a university. And there's a huge difference between, for example, La Sorbonne in Paris, a university, and this school. So it'll ring a bell only for a few of your listeners, but after about a week of not understanding exactly what was in the class, and noticing that my colleague students, much younger than I, were taking perfect notes, I walked up to the professor and asked for the reading list, the syllabus, what I was used to having always at the beginning of a course. He said, of course, there's books. There are books you could read, but there's nothing in particular. And then in the end, he said, and this is Louis XIV, he said, the course, it is me. It's what I'm presenting.
I love it.
It's what I'm presenting.
That's a very French, of course.
But that's a school. That is the school, as opposed to the university. You're responsible for what you learned. Nobody's taking attendance. If you don't show up, you won't hear what was said. And if you don't know what was presented, well then,
you won't pass.
Whereas at a university, you could only take the test at the end, and that would be fine. If you know your material, it's good.
Yeah, so we rely a lot on the teacher.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I absolutely love that.
And for you, what do you think would be the major differences between French and U.S. education, and what is the positive there?
Well, I'm almost expecting you to say, what's the positive and the negative? Because this is what was presented to me on a very practical sense. As an American, I'm coming to the old world of great tradition. Tell me what's the right way to do this, what's right, what's wrong. And it was always les avantages et les inconvénients, the advantages and the disadvantages, because there was no right way. You just had to know what your choices were. And I loved that specifically. It was frustrating at first.
Yes.
But compared to that, the American education, especially undergraduate, was completely rote, and it was virtually all the tests multiple choice, even 50 years ago. And in science and technology, a lot of that kind of thinking. Whereas here it's completely open, creative, and steeped in tradition. And what I learned was, in fact, there is one school of enology in France, and one school of viticulture is taught differently in the various locations, but there's a way of thinking, there's a way of approaching it all, and it's coherent. A friend of mine made this comment, this is about UC Davis 50 years ago. He said this is British expression, potted knowledge, because it's all derived from secondary texts, so it was all synthetic. Accumulation, it was, if you want, it was almost like meta texts.
Yes.
Whereas I could read directly what Émile Peynaud had to say about winemaking.
Yes.
Or what the tradition had been in viticulture, which really was the home base at Montpellier, was viticulture. And
now to come back on education, which this is the way we train in France education to think. Yeah. Thesis, antithesis.
I love it.
Introduction, thesis, antithesis, maybe your own personal argument, and then the conclusion. So you cannot do an essay unless you prove a counter-argument to your belief. Or you stay neutral, and then finally you give your opinion.
Yeah. Which is finally an opinion. It's a considered opinion.
How does it make us so different then in our thinking and approach between the French and the American, and how does that apply to wine?
Well, we can see, well, I will say, honestly, in the world of wine, many people are just doing what they think they're supposed to do. They're not always quite as reflective as we could be, and that's true in every part, in the United States, in France, and everywhere. People don't say, well, I do have these choices, and I could do this, but I might do that. I do think, and I know where you're going, is that the Americans would be perceived by the French to be direct, effective, bullheaded, stupid, insensitive, but they get things done, where the French are still equivocating between the possibilities, and finally they're peaufiné, they're polishing something without actually finishing the job and getting it out there.
That's very true. And I think you just summarized it so well.
Because I think there's that tension, but then we, of course, would see precisely the Australians in the same way, and the South Americans seem to always have a therapist on their side, whereas we'll just do the job.
So who is your therapist? Is it in your hand right now?
Oh, yeah. I've had more than one, especially after the fire. But let's talk about this wine for just a second.
Magic. So
this is a 16,
yes.
not a warm year, right? One of the coldest years.
That's right.
And it's coming from a mountain vineyard that is quite unlike most of Napa Valley. It's sort of ironic, sitting here with a true terroiriste, Jean-Charles.
Yep.
Napa Valley is not a single terroir by any means, but the mountain vineyards themselves are often quite distinct one from another. You can't generalize even about our Appalachian Spring Mountain. So the site, there's no volcanic soil whatsoever. It's completely sedimentary. It's steep, it's cold, the wind blows through. It almost, in a near context, doesn't seem quite like Napa.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And what was your vision? You literally created the vineyard from zero. Well, in many ways, you enhanced it, replanted it, reorganized it.
Let me say this. So I discovered a vineyard that had been planted with
Yes.
an eye to comparing themselves to Bordeaux. I could say this is not Bordeaux at all. The property was started by a couple named Kane, Jerry and Joyce Kane. They wanted to create a great wine. Who doesn't?
Yes.
And I think, how can you create a great wine? It must be there in the site.
Yes.
So that's the first
It
challenge.
has to.
And how do we know? And I would say for my first 10 years, what I discovered at Kane was that it was distinct and not similar to most of what we knew in the Napa Valley, which could be in itself problematic, right?
Yeah.
Having a wine that doesn't reflect what your neighbors have or do or want to do.
Being different is always a great advantage, but sometimes could be a disadvantage.
Well, you have both of that, and it can be difficult for sure. So there is that discovery to appreciate the vineyard for what it is, as opposed to wonder about what it is not.
That's right.
And so that process was only me about discovering. And then one more thing. One of the great enologists after Émile Peynaud in Bordeaux is Denis Dubourdieu.
Yeah, of course.
And Denis Dubourdieu actually had an appreciation of Burgundy. It's rare among the Bordelais to have any interest in what's going on in Burgundy, but he valued Burgundy, and he would tell us, well, the great wines of Burgundy. And by the way, this is a beautiful glass for
This
Grand
is a beautiful wine.
But this being said, this idea of Burgundy is about the perfume, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's actually, as we know from Jackorigo, about whom we need to
Bonjour,
speak.
Jackie.
Salut, Jackie. Je pense à toi. The texture is critical.
Yes.
It's more than just, but back to Denis Dubourdieu, for him, the great wines of Bordeaux were built on structure.
Yes.
So you have the framework and so forth. And I think if we love wine, we always go back to the vineyard. We're ultimately all vignerons. And in that sense, then building a wine is never satisfying. And the idea that we needed to structure a wine when what we want is something that's sensual and draws you in. Suddenly the idea that a wine needed to be big, powerful, and sweet to be good, it's like we're losing.
Right.
We're losing the heart. And what we want is to capture the energy of the vineyard, let it be what it will be, and not force it to have a structure that it doesn't necessarily need.
And how do you let it be? Is it by the practices you encourage, like organic, biodynamic?
That's important.
And what else for you in the Napa Valley on Spring Mountain?
Well, I think the key thing is to have living soil.
Yeah.
And this has taken us a long time to learn. But one of the
Yes.
key elements with organic is not just the absence of toxic chemicals, but it is the fact that the soil needs to be alive. And I think that if there's a message, and by the way, we have certainly done a lot of work in biodynamics, but we do not claim to be biodynamic, but appreciate what biodynamics
Yes.
brings to us, which connects all the pieces. So that it's a holistic approach to the vineyard, which is now the garden, but not just of vines, but of everything in the soil,
Yes.
growing around it and with it. And seeing all of that coming together, having living soil, is how you'll express the terroir. Chemical fertilizer and herbicide obviously gets in the way. So this is the key element. The next one is to pick the grapes, and this is my opinion, not too ripe.
That's it.
And here's a line coming from Emile Peynaud, and I'm jumping from growing to winemaking. He will say simply, remember, red wine is but a partial extraction of the grape. It's not trying to get everything.
That's it.
And similarly, I will say, and you'll recognize this, in France, there is a great attention to detail and aesthetic. Mm-hmm. And in the vineyard, too, there can be these perfectly groomed rows with not a single weed in sight, with a little rose bush at the end of the row and all of that. It turns out that overly manicured and controlled process is fighting the vineyard.
That's right.
And I surely, as an American foreigner and Francophile, it took me a while to appreciate a certain amount of disorder in the vineyard, to understand that not all the shoots need to be the same length, that not all the clusters need to be identical, and that not every berry needs to be the same perfect berry. Mm-hmm. So these are all the things I had to learn to appreciate a difficult vineyard such as Cane, where the vines are each one an individual.
And I'm so glad you used the reference of Denis Dubourdieu, rest his soul. He was my teacher in Talence for 4 months. And in addition, we had him consult with us in Burgundy, in our wineries, from Moreau to Ropito, so from Chablis all the way to the Côte de Beaune, on oxidation and on a variety of topics where he was extremely sharp to the point that he consulted with us over 10 years and loving his advice. And, to your point, we could go from one region to the other. It's totally possible to go from Bordeaux and be known in Bordeaux and go to Burgundy and express yourself beautifully, as you've done in Napa Valley. So when we talk about this wine, you indirectly described it, but describe it to our friends of the style you've created here.
Well, again, I reject the word created. I'll step aside from that and say that we don't have a wine that's simply fruity. Mm-hmm. I hope you can agree with that.
For sure.
In great,
to the point that it's empty.
In great perfume, there's always an element of animal.
Yes.
An element of musk. Mm-hmm. And
I agree.
And there has to be a willingness to not only have fruit or flowers. It all sounds sort of a little bit like flowers and fruit and everything nice would be one side, but life isn't interesting unless you have a little of
For
all.
sure.
One of the things I will say philosophy helped me understand is there's no scent, no odor that intrinsically has a value, good or bad. It's all about context. It's about where you are. Does this smell good or bad?
That's
and
right.
which memory does it evoke? So it's an amazing thing because we always say, oh no, this is a good smell. Rose is a good smell. And
So you don't believe in good and bad or in heaven and hell?
I believe in both.
Okay, good. Are you in the purgatory now for a while, or you know where you're going?
We might be. One person in my life said, "No, we're living in our hell now." And
well, that's a good way to look at it.
I think
I like our hell.
I think we can see that we're still in the Garden of Eden.
Yes, and if it was the Garden of Eden, which one would you choose? Would it be Jérôme Bosch? Garden of...
A little of everything, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, above and below.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, as above, so below.
So back to the sense here. So this is not a wine that is seeking to be or to be created. But yet I'm allowing, by not adding yeast, by allowing these things to ferment as they are, it creates a wine that is enologic winemaking incorrect. It has flaws. It's imperfect, like we are. And because of that, it's more interesting.
For sure. You don't believe in perfection, of course.
No, it's a lost
Are you seeking
idea.
for it?
No.
So what do you seek for in your life?
Connection.
Yeah. And you find it?
Yeah, and sharing. Of course. Yeah, no, there's no hope for perfection. Now, back to the sense of structure versus texture. Here we are working with varieties known to us from another part of France, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and so forth, which are not specifically of Bordeaux, but of the Loire in part, the Franc specifically, and the Côte is. So we have these different varieties all coming together in Bordeaux. But the texture is, to me, inspired more by Burgundy.
Yes.
And yet, it's not a Burgundian wine at all. It could not be. So, but we see a little connection between Piemonte and the Northern Rhone.
That's right.
And Burgundy, and we see a continuity of understanding.
And was it your plan
No.
or you just let it be?
No, we had to, it's a process of evolution and discovery. And because of my ongoing and continued interest in France, ultimately, I came to know Jackorigo, our friend, who a professor of vin et culture. He taught culture to Burgundians, including Aubert de Villaine.
For sure.
And
inspired us all with his numerous books.
That's right.
That are so phenomenally
And coming
written.
back to the idea of terroir and understanding that. And this, you probably don't have one of these, but those little silver ashtrays that we call tarte vin.
Of course. I was born with one.
People used to taste wine without any glass at all, without any sense of aroma other than what they could have in their mouth. And
all about texture.
It was all about texture, and Jackie is rediscovering, it's an archaeology of wine tasting from the Middle Ages to help us appreciate how wine could be understood in a different way. Because what I'm coming out of, a school of enology in France, but nonetheless this idea that wine would be analyzed. We had this expression, analyse sensorielle.
That's right.
And we know wine is not for analysis.
That's it. So you think we should go back to the tasting cup? The tasse de vin?
No, it's assez difficile.
You know.
I love this glass. I much prefer this. Can we taste the other one?
Oh, absolutely. So you cannot finish your own glass?
I could drink it.
Well, I think you should.
I have so
I mean,
much
what are all our friends going to believe if, as such a talented, phenomenal winemaker, he cannot taste his wine?
It's true. Generally speaking, I drink other people's wine. I do. That I think is really important, is to taste all the other wines and not taste your own. And the second thing we have to say is le vin is to be enjoyed at table with food.
That's it.
Not only as a cocktail.
So we just saw you doing what you did. Luckily, we'll recuperate it and re-drink it later.
So this is the older wine, which is fine. We'll have something with 10 years more.
So, dear friends, now 2008, which is so much of a gift you're giving us. Yeah, so you've picked intentionally, of course, two colder year.
Yeah.
Oh! I'm glad to taste with my mouth, but I like my nose.
Sure.
Because it's an interesting discussion. I was trained, slightly differently, although the tasse de vin in the 70s was still in the French cellars.
Yes, it was.
You would go down, the chain attached to the tablier.
Tablier, yeah.
And to the apron, and people were tasting that way. But I was really born smelling everything from the pillow and I smell everything.
And that is still who you are.
It's who I am because I can actually define better even wine with my nose than having it enter, the organ of the mouth and the sensory of the tongue and the mouth. And I love the nose. And here, I'm not even sure where I could place this wine.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So how was 2008?
It was one thing to say about Napa, and really we can say north coast of California, and that includes Sonoma and Mendocino, is our weather is still dominated by the Pacific. And what happens, as you know, in San Francisco, we can be covered with fog in the summer, in particular. And so we have the cold fog coming in and then eventually retreating. So there will be a few days in the summer you can go to the beach in San Francisco, a very few days.
Yeah.
So this weather's coming back and forth. We have heat waves and cold waves and heat waves, cold waves, back and forth, back and forth. And '08 was one of those years with the hot spells and the cold spells. And even a hint of rain in October. But of course, in California, it doesn't rain at all in the summer, at all. Quite unlike anywhere in Europe where we rely on rain all summer long to grow your plants. But here, no rain. So it was a typical year with a little bit later and a little colder, but with these hot spells, which I think create some challenges to ripening, because when the vines get too hot, that's hard for them too. I prefer a more gentle, continual ripening. And I would say, therefore, '07 was just like this perfect year where there was no real challenge. And in fact...
And it's become an iconic vintage.
Yeah, it's more a sense of plenitude. But I'm actually interested in difficult wines. I'm interested in things that have complexity that will keep me coming back. You'll find something else the next time.
So what are people going to say in 50 years about Chris Howell?
Hopefully they will forget me.
I doubt that.
What will they say about Cain? Well, they remember that Cain is there, you know?
Yeah.
Because again, this is the musk, isn't it? There's something else besides just grapes. And you can only do this with a wine after a few years in the bottle. Right?
I mean, the animalistic.
Yeah, animalistic is a very polite way.
It's phenomenally present. And for me as a Burgundian, I'm obviously in love with it. This is the style of wine that is really making Napa Valley a phenomenal name. So where do you see Napa Valley going these days in terms of wine styles?
I hope, like if we look at the New World, and particularly our little valley, as a place that is trying to grow up, we're beyond our adolescence, we're trying to find ourselves, and we are no longer comparing ourselves as we once did to the great wines of the world. That we would all be a great wine. We don't have the consistency or the coherence. If you go to Burgundy, you have one culture. If you go to Bordeaux, you have a culture. They're both being challenged, and we need to acknowledge climate change and global warming. And they're all
which is so dramatic.
It's a huge deal, and they're all questioning what they will be in the future.
Yeah.
Napa never really got beyond finding itself before it's already having to rediscover itself and ask truly which varieties should we be growing and how should they be styled. But it's no longer the place with 100 different kinds of wine of different varieties. It is dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon. Will it be Cabernet Sauvignon in 50 years? Could it be more like Provence? Could it be like perhaps parts of Italy? We don't know yet. Well,
interesting perspective. Huh?
But one of the things that I want to say, maybe this is a moment to sort of reach our ending point.
Yes.
But if you think of the great famous vineyards of Burgundy, we can think of Chambertin.
Mm-hmm.
As Jackie will tell us, it's been known for over 1,000 years.
Yes.
Through changes in the climate, the mini ice age, the warming period of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
But the same site persists. It's my hope that the Napa Valley will persist in that same way, independent of the changes in the climate that we will experience.
Beautifully said. Now, what's your dream?
À quoi je rêve?
Ha ha! Le rêve imaginaire.
I would say my hope is that we do not lose our humanity, that we connect ourselves to what is given to us from the sky and from the earth, and that we remember that we're human. And my thought about wine and food is they connect us back to our physical and our spiritual selves.
I love that. And now, Chris, what keeps inspiring you? Besides wine, of course.
Well, we live in such a powerfully changing time, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
It's exciting and it's scary.
But you keep being inspired, though.
Yeah.
What are the things and the elements that around us really keeps you going and inventing? And even though you
think besides wine, isn't wine enough?
Is it enough? The world is never enough.
It's where it takes us.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that's the key, is where wine takes us. And I I really feel American people, as an example, have discovered that. That wine now is becoming part of who they are and allowing them to go somewhere.
Well, I think we find this again and again and again, just as it happened for me, that someone will have a glass perhaps of even this wine, and it will light a spark that takes them outside of themselves, outside of that moment. And suddenly they're no longer saying, well, how do I analyze this? Do I call this cherries? Am I drinking a great wine, or is this not a great wine? Would my friends be impressed, or will they be dismissive? This is no longer about snobism or pretense or about show or about fashion. But they can be, in their experience, in the presence of beauty. But this is a beauty that's not created, but discovered. It's a beauty that existed, that came to be because of the vineyard, because of the year.
And because of the place.
And it would never be the same again.
I love this existential statement. Very powerful.
Okay.
Well, Chris, now is the time for you to look at our friends and send a very big message to the world. The message that you indirectly gave.
I've given it 5 times. Yeah.
Well, maybe another to everyone, and after those, in many ways, solitary 2 years that we've lived, now back into civilization.
Well, so connect yourselves to yourself first, through your senses, through your imagination, through your memory and emotion, and with that, connect to your friends.
I will start now.
Okay.
We are connected.
Sakosh. Good. Thank you.
Merci
Jean-Charles.
beaucoup. Phenomenal.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Good.
What a time, dear friends.